The summer of subtle beginnings. It was the beginning of June in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, a time when the air thickens with the promise of long days and violet-tinted dusks. Olivia Turner, 34, lived a seemingly idyllic life. Her husband, Michael, was 37, an architect known for his easy laugh and immaculate lawn care skills. Their 8-year-old son, Noah, added a layer of joyful chaos to the cozy 2-story home nestled on a tree-lined avenue. Friends described their household as one of those American dreams. Backyard cookouts, shared laughter, and an endless parade of weekend soccer games. But as summer arrived, there was a subtle shift in Olivia's world. The catalyst for this seemingly imperceptible transition came in the form of Lily Harper, Olivia's best friend since college, now 35, who recently moved back to Portland after a messy divorce. At first, Olivia was delighted. Her friendship with Lily had survived across years and states, through missed birthdays and late-night confessions. Inviting Lily to Sunday brunches, family barbecues, and impromptu movie nights felt natural at first. It was the kind of open-hearted hospitality Olivia embraced. June bled into July, and Lily became a regular fixture in the Turner household. She and Michael shared easy, effortless conversations. At first, Olivia chalked this up to old friends, finding comfort and entertainment in each other's company. There was, after all, nothing unusual about laughter echoing in the kitchen, the smell of grilled corn outside, or even the shared bottle of rosé over a spirited game of Scrabble. Yet, as the heat intensified, Olivia began to notice things she couldn't quite explain. Michael and Lily exchanging subtle glances when they thought no one was watching. The way Lily always seemed to know details about the family schedule Olivia hadn't mentioned. The infectious excitement between them that felt just slightly beyond the boundaries of normal friendship. Olivia willed herself not to overthink.
Oh, hey, Sarah.
"You're being
here.
paranoid," she'd
checking the
mutter
time.
under
Dinner
her
looks
breath
great, doesn't it?
during solo walks around the neighborhood.
James.
She blamed the restlessness on monotony, on Summer's slow crawl, on memories of Lily as a heartbroken friend who'd simply needed companionship. It wasn't until the 4th of July party, amid the laughter and the sparkle of handheld fireworks, that Olivia's gut screamed for her attention. She caught a whisper, Michael's voice, low and intimate, tinged with something she hadn't heard before. Lily's eyes darted away when she realized Olivia was watching. From that moment, Olivia knew she needed to pay attention, that the summer might hold secrets she wasn't ready for, but couldn't ignore either. Unexpected signs. Sarah didn't notice the subtle changes at first, but as July rolled on, she began to sense a shift in the air, a current of tension that didn't belong. It began innocently, a passing look between James and Jessica during a dinner party, an inside joke whispered across the room, the kind of shared laughter that didn't quite feel like hers to join. One afternoon, Sarah arrived home early from a work meeting. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of James and Jessica in the backyard, their heads bent close together in animated conversation. There was nothing overtly wrong in their body language, but something in the energy unsettled her, a lightness, a spark she hadn't seen before. Later, when she asked James about his day, he answered so casually that Sarah wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing. As summer deepened, more hints surfaced. Jessica seemed to know about family plans Sarah hadn't shared directly with her. Occasionally, Sarah found Jessica's coffee mug, one Sarah herself had bought, waiting in the sink, even on days she hadn't been invited over. Once, at the grocery store, a neighbor offhandedly mentioned seeing James and Jessica out for coffee. He said it so matter-of-factly. Sarah laughed it off, but her mind kept replaying the scene. Text messages became another clue. James began to guard his phone more closely than usual, setting it face down at dinner and excusing himself to the hallway to answer calls. Sarah stumbled upon a thread of messages between James and Jessica, full of light sarcasm and late-night memes. The kind of banter she'd assumed was reserved for her and her husband. At night, Sarah's thoughts circled restlessly. Was she being paranoid, seeing trouble where there was none? Or was her intuition raising a quiet alarm? She wanted to trust James, and yet, time and again, these tiny details pulled at her nerves. The hot Texas summer, once so promising, now pressed down with an unfamiliar heaviness. Alone in the darkness, Sarah resolved to stop brushing away her unease and start paying closer attention. She told herself it was probably nothing. Still, she couldn't ignore the mounting sense that something precious was slowly slipping out of her grasp. The silent surveillance, when the whispers of betrayal grew too loud to ignore. Julia decided she owed herself more than just suspicion. She refused to let her imagination become the judge of her marriage. This wasn't about lashing out or catching anyone in the act for revenge. It was, she told herself, about the truth and about reclaiming control over her own peace of mind. So, Julia set about observing, not as a vengeful spouse, but as a quiet chronicler in her own life's story. She started with the small things that no one else would notice. At first, she simply listened more intently to Eric's explanations about where he'd been, to Natalie's throwaway praise of Ava's newest paintings, to the way laughter seemed to echo louder when she wasn't in the room. Julia kept a journal tucked in her bedside table, capturing odd details, dates, times, fragments of overheard conversations, snippets she could revisit. Sunday evening, Natalie brought Eric his favorite beer without asking. She remembered the brand, though I never mentioned it. Eric smiled at her in a way he doesn't even try with me anymore. Next, she paid attention to schedules. Eric had always been reliable about text responses and letting her know if he'd be late. Now, his meetings ran long more and more often, and sometimes he didn't respond for hours. So Julia started saving Eric's calendar invites, screenshots of his messages, anything that could later be used to map inconsistencies. She'd ask simple questions when he came home. How was work? Noting every detail he volunteered. Then she'd cross-reference what he said with what she actually observed, or what Ava mentioned. On Natalie's side, Julia grew careful with her boundaries. She gently encouraged Natalie to go out with other friends or reconnect with her old social circles in Boulder, explaining how she too could use more time for herself. Natalie usually found a reason to say no, lingering around the house instead, helping out with errands, acting almost like a second wife. Julia started tracking how often Natalie stayed over versus returning to her own apartment, keeping an informal log. In the last 6 weeks, she's only slept at her own place 6 times. Julia's next step was more methodical. She developed a pattern of arriving home unexpectedly, picking up Ava early from school, scheduling last-minute dental cleanings, running faux errands. These pop-ins were always met with hurried, guilty smiles. Once, she caught Eric and Natalie fixing a leaky pipe in the guest bathroom together, laughing quietly about teamwork. The tension in the air when Julia entered the room was unmistakable, and even Ava noticed, tugging at her mother's hand with a worried whisper. Julia combed through devices, too, never outright snooping, but noting patterns. Late-night texting, sudden silences when she entered the room, Eric jumping up to answer calls in the yard. She took photos of call logs, never opening private messages, but always watching the timestamps. Every screenshot, every calendared oddity, every uneaten dinner plate became a puzzle piece in a growing mural of suspicion. Through all this, Julia struggled between desperation and hope. She balked at the idea of confronting Eric and Natalie without clear proof. She valued truth over drama and dignity over emotional carnage. The silent surveillance wore her down some days. Other times, it empowered her, centering her actions in choice rather than reactive agony. She still cooked dinner, still attended Ava's soccer matches, still asked Eric about his day. But beneath the surface, Julia collected everything: the laughter, the closed doors, the just friends glances, and steeled herself for whatever truth would soon emerge. As summer reached its melting apex, Julia's notes formed an almost clinical archive. The evidence wasn't just an indictment. It was a monument to her patient courage and steely resolve. Her plan wasn't set yet, but she knew she wouldn't walk blindly anymore. The summer had started with secrets. Julia was ready for it to end with clarity, preparing for the moment of truth. Julia's journey toward the decisive moment began quietly, woven through the routines of her everyday life. She wanted her next steps to be carefully calculated, rooted in clarity, not anger, because she owed herself and her daughter a controlled, dignified confrontation instead of a reckless explosion. The heartbreak simmered, but she refused to let it define her. Instead, she focused on gathering herself, planning meticulously for the moment when everything would come to light. First, Julia focused on her emotional preparation. She stopped blaming herself. She realized the knot of suspicion wasn't just about Mark or Charlotte, but about reclaiming her own voice after months of self-doubt. Long walks through the neighborhood, past rows of blooming daisies, and the scent of fresh-cut grass became her daily sanctuary. She practiced conversations in the quiet of her car or before drifting off to sleep. Sometimes she wept in the shower, letting the water carry away her frustration, then stared herself down in the foggy mirror with a new determination. She reached out to her sister, Allison, who lived 2 states away. Without sharing every detail, Julia confided enough to feel lighter, taking in compassionate advice and strength from the family she trusted. Allison reminded her, "No matter how this ends, you'll still be Julia Harper. You have nothing to be ashamed of." Those words anchored her, even as she rehearsed possible scenarios for what would come next. Planning the confrontation became a quiet project. Julia decided to organize a family barbecue for Labor Day, a beloved Maplewood tradition and an annual marker of summer's end. She handled every detail, setting the menu, organizing Zoe's crafts for the kids, inviting close friends and family, and of course, including Charlotte and Mark. She even invited her in-laws and a few old friends of Mark's, wanting witnesses who would help temper the evening, transforming it from an ambush to an unveiling. She told herself, the point isn't revenge, it's the truth, laid bare for those who matter most. In the days leading up to the barbecue, Julia collected every piece of evidence: texts, recorded calendar inconsistencies, even a folder of time-stamped photos, into a file stored securely on her laptop and backed up on a flash drive locked away in her bedside drawer. She rehearsed what she would say and committed herself to staying calm no matter how Mark or Charlotte reacted. Her tone would be steady. She wanted to show Zoe, no matter her age, that even in heartbreak, dignity matters. She even prepared for the fallout. Julia spoke discreetly with a family therapist, prearranging sessions for herself and for Zoe, in anticipation of the emotional turbulence ahead. She researched legal resources, just in case, refusing to let herself be blindsided by what might come after the secret was out. She knew Maplewood was a small town. Rumors would fly, judgments would come, but her sense of self had been quietly reforged in the private furnace of her ordeal. The night before the barbecue, Julia didn't sleep much. She sat at the kitchen table, eyes roaming over Zoe's crayon drawings taped to the fridge. She let herself feel everything: sorrow for the past, fear for the present, and a strange, steady pride for the woman she was becoming. She wasn't only about to reveal a betrayal, she was about to reclaim her own story, on her terms. When Labor Day dawned, the Harpers' backyard was alive with laughter and color. Guests arrived bearing potato salad, pitchers of sweet tea, cheerful smiles masking the undercurrents unique to every family event. Julia wore a navy blue sundress, her hair pinned up, and let her nerves settle beneath a welcoming smile. Mark flipped burgers at the grill. Zoe chased bubbles with friends. Charlotte moved through the crowd, laughing too brightly. Everything looked perfect, and Julia knew it was time to rewrite the ending of her summer. Tonight, the truth would finally step out of the shadows, and she would meet it head-on, with the world watching. The truth revealed. The summer evening glimmered with promise as Julia's backyard came alive for the barbecue. Strings of paper lanterns swayed from tree branches, voices mingled amid laughter, and the scent of charcoal mingled with the sweetness of gardenias blooming along the fence. Mia and her younger brother, Ben, dashed through the grass with friends, oblivious to the grown-up currents running just beneath the surface. Julia moved through the party with practiced grace, greeting neighbors, passing out iced tea, and accepting compliments on the decorations. Lauren arrived fashionably late, wearing a bright teal sundress and a nervous smile. Richard flitted between the grill and his guests, his eyes finding Lauren now and then, a flash of unspoken meaning between them that Julia, at last, no longer wanted to ignore. As dusk settled, Julia gathered everyone in the yard. Her voice was calm, but she felt every molecule in her body tense with resolve. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her eyes meeting those of Lauren and Richard for just a moment longer than necessary. "You've all been part of this family's story for years. Tonight, I need to share something that matters deeply to me, not just as a wife or a mother, but as myself." The guests quieted, the children tiptoeing closer. Julia reached for the remote, and with a click, images flickered to life on the outdoor projector. Photos, time-stamped receipts, screenshots, the careful, gentle evidence of her silent months. She narrated without bitterness, laying out her observations, how routines shifted, how trust felt bent, how love could be undermined, not with grand betrayals, but with 1,000 small, accumulating secrets. The shock rippled through the crowd. Richard's face blanched. Lauren appeared frozen, a silent plea trembling behind her eyes. Julia continued, voice unwavering. "The truth matters to me more than pretending," she said softly, "because honesty is what allows us to begin again, no matter the shape of that beginning." For long seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Richard tried to explain himself. His words stuttered, trailing away in the face of Julia's calm certainty. Lauren's hands shook, tears welling. The hush was absolute, the kind of silence that falls when something brave and irreversibly honest has been said aloud. Julia's father stepped forward, wrapping her in a gentle hug. Her friends murmured their support. Her children clung to her arms. But Julia needed no defense. She stood squarely in the mess of what had been her marriage, refusing shame or fury, insisting only on dignity. Lauren whispered an apology so quiet, it might have been lost on the breeze. Richard pleaded for forgiveness, but Julia only shook her head. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to reclaim myself. All I ask is that you both be honest, for yourselves, and before everyone who loves us. The barbecue ended with a surge of kindness from friends. Plates gathered in stacks. Children whisked home for bedtime. The Emerson backyard, once the stage for 1,000 family memories, felt transformed by the clarity Julia had summoned. Later, when the night was almost over, Julia tucked her children into bed. Mia, pale-faced and tired, pressed close. Are we still a family? She asked in a trembling whisper. Julia enfolded her in a hug. Yes, sweetheart, and we always will be, no matter how our family changes. What matters is our love and our truth. Alone at the kitchen table, Julia let herself cry. Tears of loss, but also relief and a peculiar hope. Love, she realized, doesn't always look the way you expect, but self-respect and honesty are the roots that allow life to keep growing, even after heartbreak. Reactions and consequences. In the days following the revelation, a heavy, almost tangible silence settled over the Emerson household. The party was over, but the echo of exposed secrets reverberated in every corner. Julia woke to a house changed, its familiar patterns disrupted by the aftershock of truth. There was no more pretending. Still, she'd underestimated how deeply the consequences would snake their way through every relationship and routine. The first morning dawned gray and headachy. Richard had left early, his car absent from the driveway. Lauren, too, was gone. Her overnight bag had disappeared from the guest room, and Julia found a folded note on the kitchen table. It read only, I'm sorry. I never meant for things to happen this way. Lauren. Julia stood at the counter, running her finger over the ink, searching for the anger she thought she'd feel. But instead, she only felt tired. The truth was out. That should have been a relief. But now she was left with the daunting task of rebuilding her life from the burnt-out remnants of marital trust. Mia, Julia's daughter, was unusually quiet at breakfast. She pushed her cereal around her bowl, glancing at her mother with questions hovering in her eyes. Julia reached across the table, covering Mia's hand with her own, and gently said, Whatever happens, I'm here. You can talk to me. Mia nodded, her lip trembling. Is Dad coming back? She whispered. Julia paused. He's still your father, and he still loves you. But things are different now. We'll get through this together. The consequences rippled outward, out into the town, to friends, family, and neighborhood grapevines. By late morning, Julia's phone pulsed with messages. Her mother called, furious in her defense. How dare they treat you like this? Friends sent texts of support or offered to take Mia for ice cream or a play date. Julia was both grateful and overwhelmed, each gesture reminding her that while she was not alone, everyone seemed to have their own perspective on what came next. Richard tried to text, then call. Julia did not reply at first. When he eventually returned to the house to gather his things, he looked gaunt beneath the porch light. They sat together at the kitchen table, the same place where so many ordinary nights had unfolded, now the site of impossible conversations. Richard's voice broke as he apologized, reaching for explanations that sounded hollow, even to his ears. Julia listened, not out of a desire for reconciliation, but because she owed it to herself to hear every facet of the truth. I can't undo what I did, he finally said, but I never stopped loving you. Julia wrapped her arms around herself. Love isn't about what you say. It's about what you do and what you protect. He left quietly. Julia watched his car disappear down the street and then closed the door. Alone, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for what she'd lost, but for the person she'd been before everything changed. The practical consequences began to unfold almost at once. There were legal appointments to schedule, quiet but tense calls with her attorney to discuss next steps, separation, custody, the inventory of shared assets. Julia hated every minute of it. The bureaucracy of heartbreak, the paperwork of a life coming undone. But she moved through it deliberately, refusing to let denial or impatience rob her of agency. For Mia's sake, she chose words carefully. She and Richard sat together with their daughter on the living room sofa, explaining, simply but honestly, that they would be living apart, but would both always love her. The tears streamed down Mia's cheeks. Julia wiped them, a hollow pain, pinching her chest, but she did not look away. Children, she realized, deserve the same truth that adults did, even if that truth was hard. The consequences weren't all legal or logistical. Emotional fallout arrived in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes keening. Julia experienced everything from rage to nostalgia, guilt to fleeting hope. The hardest moments, oddly, were the small ones. Folding laundry that still smelled faintly of Richard's cologne, seeing Mia root through the closet in search of her father's old baseball glove. There were nights when Julia stayed up late, scrolling through photos on her phone, remembering vacations and Christmas mornings and lazy afternoons when everything had seemed solid. She allowed herself to mourn. Out in the community, reactions varied. There were neighbors who ostentatiously avoided eye contact at the market. Others delivered casseroles or offered comforting hugs in the yoga studio. A few, emboldened by gossip, asked intrusive questions Julia shut down with the polite firmness of someone no longer willing to explain herself or her family. Lauren, meanwhile, had vanished. Word sifted back through friends that she'd left town, at least for now, seeking solace in anonymity. Richard's relationship with Mia became, by necessity, newly tender, but also shadowed by uncertainty. He tried to make up for the loss with weekend trips to the lake and texted silly jokes. But children are often wiser than we give them credit for, and Mia resisted these overtures at first. Julia encouraged her daughter to maintain a relationship with her father, even as she kept firm boundaries. She wanted to teach Mia resilience and forgiveness, not blind trust, but the strength to face discomfort and loss without letting them define her. The broader family was rocked in subtler ways. Julia's parents visited more often, sometimes arguing about next steps, whether Julia should forgive, whether the family should rally behind her, or extend an olive branch to Richard. These arguments swelled through the house. More than once, Julia had to remind them that it was her life, her decision. Nights were quiet, except for the occasional hum of the dishwasher, the soft sound of Mia crying in her sleep, Julia's own heart pounding a steady, painful rhythm. Despite the pain, Julia began to see glimmers of possibility. She returned to old hobbies, gardening, running along the river trail. She started a journal, not of suspicions, but of dreams for her and Mia's new chapter. When she spoke to her therapist, Julia reflected on what she'd endured and how clarity, painful as it had been, opened the door for her own growth. One Saturday, weeks after the seismic barbecue, a few friends came by for coffee and conversation on the back porch. They laughed openly, sharing stories of their own heartbreaks, vulnerabilities, and small victories. For the first time in what felt like years, Julia found herself not defined by her role as wife or mother, or even as a woman betrayed, but simply as herself. She was allowed to feel lightness again. Some days, loneliness was sharper. There was a particular morning, a rainy October Sunday, when Julia woke to the sound of rain beating against the window and realized how profoundly her world had changed. She mourned, she wept, and then she got up and made pancakes for breakfast, savoring the routine. These acts of normalcy became a kind of healing incantation, proof that life, in all its small complications, could march forward. Mia began to adjust, too. Slowly, with therapy and gentle encouragement, she found new ways to express her feelings. Together, mother and daughter spent evenings baking, reading, dreaming aloud about traveling to the coast. The house, though quieter, became cozier, a place of honesty rather than secrets. Julia bought new curtains, painted the living room, and on a whim, signed up for a pottery class at the community center. Each small act was a piece of her reclaiming herself, a way of building a life, not around betrayal, but around hope and intention. Richard, for his part, began to accept the shape his own consequences took. Living alone for the first time in years, he confronted his own choices in the echo of empty rooms. He apologized again and again. Some apologies returned and released, others unheard. There were counseling sessions, attempts at healing, but the window for reconciliation had closed. Lauren, too, struggled. From time to time, Julia received a neutral postcard or a short email, never asking for forgiveness outright, but expressing a quiet sorrow for the rift created. Whether their friendship could ever be restored was a question Julia chose to leave unanswered, at least for now. Eventually, the small town reached equilibrium. Gossip faded. People moved on to other news. Yet for Julia and Mia, the change was indelible. There were new memories made. Pumpkin carving in October, the soft hush of snow at Christmas, a summer camping trip just for the two of them. Julia cautiously opened her heart to new friendships and even let herself imagine, someday, the possibility of love again, though only on her own terms. Through it all, Julia's greatest lesson wasn't about heartbreak. It was about the power of facing consequences openly, meeting pain with honesty instead of bitterness. She learned to speak her truth, to comfort her daughter in the darkest moments, to remember that her worth was not dependent on anyone else's choices. On the anniversary of that tumultuous barbecue, Julia and Mia lit sparklers in the backyard, not to erase the past, but to celebrate survival and new beginnings. Looking up into the wide, forgiving night, Julia breathed deeply, realizing the consequences had not only changed her, they had, in some strange and difficult way, set her free. The world, with all its hurt and hope, was still wide open before them. And Julia, steadier, wiser, unafraid, walked forward, with her daughter at her side, ready for whatever came next. Finding peace after the storm, after the chaos, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the slow unraveling of years of marriage and friendship, there is a remarkable quiet that settles over a person's life. A quiet not of resignation, but of definite, thoughtful, and sometimes unexpected peace. For Julia, the journey to find this tranquility was not an easy one, nor was it a straight path. It was filled with setbacks and moments of deep pain, but also with surprising sparks of joy and self-rediscovery she never could have imagined in the darkest nights. The morning after the final legal papers were signed, Julia stood at her kitchen window with a mug of coffee wrapped in both hands. The sun was rising pale and gold over Maplewood, catching the edges of every leaf and roof tile in gentle fire. This is what they mean by starting over, she thought. A sentiment she'd heard countless times, but never understood until now. For once, she wasn't waking with dread or anxiety, wasn't bracing herself for another confrontation or another raw, exhausting conversation about the affair. The house still held echoes of sorrow, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, but open. In those first weeks, Julia's heart was raw, every sense heightened, as if her body was relearning what it meant to exist without Richard's daily presence or Lauren's laughter in the background. She realized, sometimes with relief and sometimes with loneliness, how much of her life had been shaped around the needs and routines of others. Now, suddenly, her time belonged wholly to herself and her daughter. Simple things became monumental achievements. Cooking dinner to her own taste, sleeping across the bed, driving with the windows down and her favorite music blaring, painting the living room a color Richard had always vetoed. Mia, too, was learning how to move through this changed world. At first, her daughter was bitter, quiet, sometimes prone to angry outbursts, sometimes curled up on the sofa in silence. Julia let those feelings come, sitting with her, acknowledging the pain. Some nights they both cried, but Julia made a point to keep the house full of gentle routines, a Saturday pancake breakfast, reading stories together on the porch swing, planting tulips in the front yard. She signed Mia up for a swim class, went to every lesson, and cheered from the sidelines, even when her mind spun with worry for the future. Acceptance did not come all at once. It was a quiet, everyday process, one marked by setbacks as much as small victories. There were awkward moments with neighbors who didn't know what to say, old friends who vanished, and new friends who appeared. Julia learned how to accept help, how to refuse pity, and, eventually, how to rebalance her self-worth. She journaled at night, pouring out all her anger, confusion, and tentative hopes. She rediscovered an old love of sketching, documenting the changing seasons from her kitchen window, the blooming of dogwoods, the red flash of autumn, the long, bluish afternoons of winter. There were tangible changes as well. Julia found a job at a local gallery, something she'd set aside years ago to focus on her family. The work was tiring in a different way. Sometimes the paychecks barely covered bills, but the pride she felt in her independent life was unlike anything she'd known before. She started running on the river's trail in the mornings, first shuffling, then jogging, and finally feeling her body grow strong again under her own momentum. Sometimes Mia would ride her bike ahead and shout encouragement, and Julia felt her heart begin to heal in those sunlit moments. Therapy, which at first felt awkward and unnecessary, became a lifeline. Julia and Mia went together, laughing over awkward icebreakers, or sometimes crying through the hard questions. Over time, both found language for their pain, and the bitterness that had scarred their relationship began to fade. Mia became less withdrawn, and Julia found herself breathing easier, crying less, forgiving more, not just Richard and Lauren, but herself as well. Inevitably, there were setbacks. Every so often, pain would ricochet through her without warning. On family holidays, when the empty chair at the table seemed too loud. At parent-teacher conferences where other families came in pairs. And even in moments of happiness, when guilt or nostalgia crept up. Julia learned not to suppress these feelings, but to ride them out, trusting that the storm would pass. Her therapist reminded her, peace isn't the absence of pain. It's knowing how to face pain honestly and still choose life. The divorce, for all its ugliness, had given Julia a new framework. She discovered that a single-parent household could be warm and vivid and full of love. She made new memories with Mia, canning strawberry jam in the kitchen, camping beside the river, evening walks through the old neighborhoods where the trees burned orange and scarlet with fall. Each small tradition was a stone in the path back toward herself. Outside her family, Julia slowly began to grow into the broader world again. She accepted invitations from friends, movie nights, book clubs, gallery openings. At first she was shy, feeling as if everyone saw her as the woman whose husband had an affair. But over time, small laughter and inside jokes returned to her life. She even started dating, cautiously at first, never forcing herself to move faster than felt right. Some dates were disasters, others developed into tentative friendships. Most importantly, Julia established firm boundaries. She would never lose herself in another person again, and she made this clear to anyone she let through her door. Richard, for his part, was a persistent but ultimately peripheral figure. They maintained civility for Mia's sake, coordinating visits and special events. He apologized, sometimes agonizingly, sometimes perfunctorily. But the apologies didn't matter as much anymore. Julia no longer measured her worth by his remorse or her happiness by his approval. She was kinder in her heart, less quick to anger, but unmoved by the past. Sometimes they even managed to discuss Mia's school projects with a co-parenting sense of teamwork. That was enough. Lauren never returned to Maplewood, at least not during that first year. Julia heard from mutual friends about her small victories and her own struggles. There were times Julia felt ready to forgive, and other times when the memory of betrayal ached too fresh. Ultimately, peace with Lauren meant letting the past live where it belonged, behind her. She didn't need a final confrontation or even closure. The absence spoke for itself, and Julia found, with surprise, that she lacked bitterness. The most profound change was internal. With each passing season, Julia's sense of self cooled and clarified. She realized how much of herself she'd let fade for the sake of harmony. She started each morning with a small act of self-kindness. A run, a favorite breakfast, a call to her sister. She set new goals, big and small, not just to survive, but to flourish. When Mia brought home a drawing from school, Julia hung it proudly. When she felt like crying, she allowed it. When she laughed, the sound was genuine. As spring returned, Julia allowed herself to hope more freely. She and Mia started a vegetable garden, learning together the patience of nurturing something new. The first small tomato, the tallest sunflower, the sweet snap peas. These became landmarks on their road to recovery. Julia found purpose in the small, ordinary acts of living, making the beds with fresh sheets, baking bread on rainy Saturdays, learning to bike again after decades, even tackling small home repairs with grim determination and more laughter than she'd expected. Through all this, Julia relearned how to trust herself with joy. She scheduled a weekend away with Mia to the coast. They ate seafood until their fingers were sticky and ran down the beach, letting the wind tangle their hair. Sometimes, side by side in their hotel room, they whispered dreams about the future, college, travel, maybe even a pet dog. Julia wrote each dream down and tucked the list into her journal, an anchor for her hope, a promise to herself and her daughter that better days were still coming. At the gallery, Julia's confidence grew. She curated her first solo show, featuring local artists and even including a few of her own landscapes. Friends and strangers alike applauded her courage, and she found herself walking home with a light step, heart full of the pride she once thought she'd lost. On tough days, she turned again to art. Her sketches, now bold and unafraid, filled page after page, each stroke a testament to her regained sense of self. Meanwhile, Mia flourished too. Her grades steadied, her laugh became less guarded, and she made new friends on the swim team. Julia watched her daughter learn resilience, and their bond, forged in hardship, grew deeper than ever before. They developed small rituals, board game nights, garden chores, afternoon baking marathons. Each day, the house filled with more of Mia's chatter and less of the haunted silence that once ruled their evenings. Peace, Julia knew, had not erased the past. The scars were still there, old wounds that sometimes prickled on difficult anniversaries or during sudden, unexpected waves of grief. She no longer hated those marks. Instead, she honored them as proof that both she and Mia were survivors, not victims. They carried the memory of betrayal, but they were defined by what came after: strength, compassion, and the resilience to start again. Toward the end of that first year, Julia allowed herself to reflect, truly reflect, on what she wanted moving forward. She wasn't searching for a replacement for Richard or even a new partner. Instead, she wanted to build a life centered on authenticity, connection, and hope. For the first time in years, she felt worthy and whole on her own. She started to reach out, gently, to help others going through similar heartbreak, sharing her story at a support group, offering rides to parents at swim practice, volunteering at the art co-op. Service, she found, was its own kind of healing. The seasons continued to cycle, and with each turning, Julia and Mia gained a little more faith in themselves and in the possibility of happiness. One chilly autumn evening, they hosted their own small celebration, a new beginnings dinner, just the two of them. Jazz played on the radio, candles flickered on the table, and Mia presented Julia with a homemade card. "We made it, Mom. I love our family." In that quiet moment, Julia felt a profound sense of gratitude. Looking back, she saw not only the hurricane of grief, but also the deep pools of peace that followed. She thought about what she had gained: compassion for herself, a genuine relationship with her daughter, the courage to build a future not predetermined by fear or disappointment. Her home, once a reminder of betrayal, now represented resilience. Each plant in the garden, each painting on the wall, each familiar laugh was a testament to the beauty possible after pain. Sometimes, alone with a cup of tea and an open window, Julia would think about Richard and Lauren. She wished them well, genuinely, even if it surprised her. She hoped they too found their own versions of peace. The wound their actions left had healed not with time alone, but with intention, effort, and the ongoing work of self-forgiveness. Peace, Julia realized, didn't mean pretending the divorce or its aftermath hadn't happened. Real peace lived alongside the memories and disappointments. It meant waking up each morning, choosing hope over bitterness, and loving fiercely herself and her daughter, regardless of what the past held. It meant looking in the mirror and seeing not a woman broken by betrayal, but one shaped by trial and made stronger in the aftermath. At the 1-year mark, Julia and Mia went back to the little riverside cabin they'd visited after the divorce was final, a pilgrimage to honor their journey. Standing on the porch, the breeze full of possibility, Julia felt the last remnants of her anger and grief slip quietly away. She breathed in, letting the present fill her. The path ahead was hers to write, and while pain would always be a part of her story, it no longer defined her. Finding peace after the storm wasn't a single moment, but a mosaic, 1,000 choices to get out of bed, to laugh, to forgive, to try again. And in living those choices, Day after day, Julia discovered something she never thought possible in those first dark days after the truth came out. A life not only mended, but beautiful in its own brave, imperfect way.